So, welcome everybody. I think people are having a seat and putting on their headsets. And maybe we should start with, there's up in the right corner. If you click it, there's a chat window where you can type in and introduce yourself. Say your name, your occupation, what country you come from, because I think we have people from all over the world. And maybe what interests you most in space. And then in about a minute or two, we will start the show. So nobody's in the same continent so far. That's quite interesting. I'm impressed, Jonathan. 4 a.m. That's dedication. I appreciate that. That's good to see. Now, Barcelona. I like seeing where you're all from. India, Germany, Ecuador.
Yep, Robert's there. Hi, Robert.
So for those who just arrived, we've asked everyone to write their name and tell us where they're from and what it is that interests them the most about space. Space entrepreneur in propulsion.
Oh, Doug Wheelock is on. He's a good buddy of mine up at Glenn Research Center up in Cleveland, Ohio. I might even say something about Doug's experiences with crisis management. That just might happen.
Okay, I look forward to that. Very good. Yes. So, welcome everybody. This is our second webinar with Gregory Box-Johnson. Today we're going to talk about astronaut skills, crisis management, the importance of a positive attitude, and our upcoming online course, Astronaut Skills for the 21st Century. You're welcome to write your questions along the way in the chat window, and then afterwards we will take those questions and answer them. And I see you're continuing to write where you're from, and that's very good. So we look forward to look at that better afterwards. So my name is Hjertus Marsson, and I am the Chief Communications Officer of Space Nation. And I'm talking to you from Copenhagen, Denmark. With me from Houston, Texas is Gregory Box-Johnson, our Chief Space Officer. Greg is a veteran fighter pilot, flew the Endeavour space shuttle on missions STS-123 and STS-134, has spent about 30 days in space and on board the International Space Station, and was for years the head of CASIS, the Center for Advancement of Science in Space. Greg is now our Chief Space Officer, sharing with you his experiences and lessons from his training as an astronaut and his missions in space, both here in our online course and on our astronaut training expeditions in Iceland. So Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Hjertur. Happy to be here. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. I don't know the source of it, but our manager is probably going to deal with that. Are you hearing any background noise? I am too, a little bit.
Yeah, I heard a little bit. No I don't hear it anymore.
But Hjertur, I love your backdrop. Can you show me where Copenhagen is on that map behind you?
Thank you. I'm a big fan of maps, and I'm trying here to do like the weather people.
Oh, that's good. There you go.
Always
right
impressed
there.
me. So yeah, I'm right here, Copenhagen, Denmark, Scandinavia.
Very nice. And I'm out in space here. I've got the stars and the moon behind me, and it's very special for us to arrange this talk being out in space. No, we're doing these virtual backdrops today. We just thought it'd be fun and have a little bit of fun here. thanks for the intro here, Tor. You know, since I left what I call the rat race 2 years ago, I've been involved in a lot of different astropreneur, entrepreneurs in space initiatives, several startups, an incubator in Traverse City, Michigan, and helped bringing the space community to Michigan. But one of the neat things I've gotten involved with, and he's on our Space Nation team, Stefan Recke, is involvement with the Global Entrepreneurial Network, Global Entrepreneurship Network, Space Delegation. And we meet several times a year, but the big meeting is once a year. Last year it was in Bahrain. And we're actually trying to treat space just like other delegations for countries, space as a location, and share ideas in a network that can further space for not only individual countries or existing networks like the International Space Station, but for everybody. So the globalization, democratization of space as we know it. So
you mean like we should look at space as a separate country, and maybe if we do that, we could, I'm just, thinking out loud here, we could avoid space becoming some sort of this unconquered land that different countries are racing for, and we need to negotiate with space as a single unity in some way.
Absolutely, and the International Space Station is a great example of that cooperation. To my knowledge, over the last 20 years, politics has never made it to the International Space Station. But
yeah, that's impressive. I mean, it was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, wasn't it, recently?
It was, and I think it will again. So thank you for the introduction here, Tor. I'm going to talk a little bit about you because you have specialties in crisis management and reputation control for not only countries, but huge groups. And you're involved in the economic, not marketing, but messaging of the collapse in Iceland in 2008, like we were all around the country. You've been in South America working those things with crisis management, Nepal. You've gone on lots of expeditions to Antarctica and to Iceland. And so you're a very interesting person. You were very tough last year when we were on that expedition in Iceland together.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. Iceland really challenges you. So, I guess I have the benefit of growing up there. So, yeah, I got it with my mother milk.
So to kick things off, I think it's very appropriate that we have this discussion about crisis management.
So,
yeah.
Yes. So that's the first topic. So today we're going to talk about crisis management to start with. And that's where we ended in our last session. We were talking about expeditionary skills, adaptability, and then crisis management. And that's where we're going to take up today. And I imagine that Greg, you have seen quite a lot of crises in your line of work. So what would be your number one advice to people that find themselves in some sort of a crisis?
Can I take this? Sure.
Yeah, we might want everybody to mute because we have a whole bunch of people here. And thank you everyone from coming in from all over the world. But, crisis management has sort of been a central theme to my entire career here, Tor. It's been, I was a fighter pilot and a combat pilot in the Air Force. And I'm not going to dwell into that, but I think I'm going to keep to the space analogy because the space analogy not only has the crisis management, but it has a lot of the other features like isolation and how we deal with ourselves in a new situation. And it resonates to me as we're all globally connected around the planet. So I'd say the first point is, as an astronaut, we train and train and train for the malfunctions that we expect to have, but we can't train every malfunction. And so then we have what's called process or communication training to deal with basically any kind of malfunction that we might encounter. I think secondly, you got to stay cool. You got to stay calm. You got to focus on the center of gravity of the situation. One nice golden nugget that I received from Neil Armstrong, and it was reinforced by his brother Dean just last year at the 50th anniversary celebration of the first lunar landing, is Neil's big point to his brother was to focus on, with all the different things in a situation, find the one that's the most important, the center of gravity, focus on that element, and all the secondary elements will soften and then eventually come together in the solution. And Dean said that he's been doing that, following his brother's advice his entire life. And I think those are great words to live by.
Center of gravity, that makes perfect sense. Now, I have no combat experience or anything like that. My country doesn't even have an army. So I focus on communications, and we have a similar way there. So number one is one point of contact. You need to make sure that you always have the correct information. So you have a focus point. You know where to get the right information. You know where to give the right information, so that you always have the correct information in one place where everyone can get the info. Number two, which I think is very important in crisis, from my standpoint, is it's not what happens, it's how you react to it. And I often think people focus too much on who's to blame, what went wrong, why it went wrong. And especially, I imagine in your cases, you need to think really, really fast. And of course, you need to know what went wrong, but there's no time to think about why it went wrong or who is to blame. You need to think forwards. Where are we heading from here? You need to, well, in the communications we talk about, you need to own the narrative. So you need to write the story yourself. Don't let the events take control. You need to take control of the events that are going to happen after that crisis. And finally, as you talk about creating calmness, I imagine the attitude is one of the most important factors. So you don't create panic, you keep your mind head. Do you have any examples of cases or crises that you've dealt with on board the space shuttle?
Well, a few come to mind. I'd like to highlight my good friend Doug Wheelock's mission 120, STS-120. Wheels was out on the crew that took out, I think, the third of the fourth solar arrays on the International Space Station. There's Wheels with one of the makeshift tools they used. I think it was affectionately called the hockey stick. But the solar array had a problem unfurling, and it got snagged by that guide wire. And so this is probably the closest analogy to the Apollo 13 scenario that we had in the space shuttle program, where they had to figure out how to fix this thing during that flight. And all the great minds on the ground and in space, their ingenuity was key to solving this problem. And so they built cufflinks, not unlike that contraption they made for Apollo 13, and repaired the solar array, and then went outside and unfurled it. It was an amazing effort of innovation and teamwork to successfully accomplish this mission. And Wheels.
So, do you think we'll see a movie about it?
I'm certain there'll be a movie about it, but I'm probably gonna put a paper that Wheels wrote about it a few years ago and stick it on LinkedIn so everybody can read more about that really cool mission. And he gave me 2 lessons that he wanted me to share with you all. Ingenuity and clarity of thought are critical to a high-functioning team, and there is no limit to what you can do if it's not important who gets the credit. And I think you were talking a little bit about that here, Tor, earlier. Another example of crisis management was my very first flight. 8 seconds into the flight, we had a fairly major malfunction that we never trained to. And so, as we said before, for minor malfunctions that we haven't trained, it's important to have a good communication process. I think our communication process broke down a little bit. And so we all as a crew didn't expect a very abnormal external tank release right as we had main engine cut off. And we had a couple other unexpected things that happened because we really weren't talking to each other using those communication channels that we trained for. A second one was on that same flight when we hit a micrometeoroid, and I think I sent Kali a photo of the window. So we had 4 rookies on that flight, and this micrometeoroid hit the window you can see in the upper left. It was pretty impressive. Now it's triple redundant on the windows, the front windows of the space shuttle, but that took a pretty good divot out of the thermal pane. And remember, we had a reentry problem with our thermal protection system. So all the rookies look at that flight and were pretty impressed. The engineers did a bunch of analysis. They figured out that it was fine. Everybody stayed calm. Maybe the veterans were a little bit calmer than we rookies. But I got blamed for it because I was flying the shuttle at the time. We were undocking and doing the fly around.
So you hit the meteorite?
Yeah, so I caused it. I mean,
they didn't teach you to dodge that?
But
well,
that,
I think
that
it's quite
kind of
impressive. I
underscores.
mean, I don't know anyone else who's been hit by a meteorite. That's quite unique.
Well, it was a micrometeoroid. It's just a small version of a meteoroid. I think they become ites when once they enter our atmosphere. And then the final. Oh, go ahead.
You say. I imagine that one of the tricks in all of this is you train in simulators thousands and thousands of hours before you actually head into space. But I imagine, and from the stories that I've been hearing, that because you've done so much training and you've thought about all possible scenarios that could go wrong, when something goes wrong, it's usually something that you never trained for because it was outside of your scope, because you had taken care of everything else. Isn't that correct? So it's more about processes and how to deal with the situation than knowing exactly what to do in exactly these kind of situations.
So I think it's both, right? The bigger ones we trained for, and we weren't surprised. And on the Hubble flight, I was Capcom on the last Hubble flight, STS-125. They had a malfunction that they trained a bunch of times in the sim. So it went like clockwork, and everybody knew what to expect. And there didn't have to be that much communication because we had trained it so much. But there are other malfunctions, like the one I had, and of course the one Wheels had on STS-120, that you got to stick to the tenets of staying calm, focusing on the center of gravity of the problem, using the skills of all the team members, listen, and come up with a good execution plan to get through the problem. And they did very successfully. I guess the last one I'll bring up, and then we'll have time for questions, was my last flight. During training, and we had an extended training period because they slipped our flight because of the redesign of the alpha magnetic spectrometer. But our commander, Mark Kelly, his wife, Congressman Gabby Giffords, was shot in the head just a couple months before we were planning on launching. And that happened on the ground, but that was truly a situation of crisis management. And so we initially had to triage. Of course, she had to triage and just survive it, which she did amazingly. But our families, our crew, the space community, and frankly, the world had to deal with that crisis. And there were a lot of unknowns. And what ended up happening was we got through the situation. We got Mark back on the crew. We had enhancements to our training because of that hardship. And we trained with a very experienced other shuttle commander when Mark was in Arizona. And we came through it as a stronger team than we were before. And we executed a flawless mission. And something that we can be really proud of, putting up the AMS that's still up there collecting data for the world. So I believe when we're stressed by challenges like we are in this pandemic with COVID-19, it's difficult. We've got to keep our eye on the ball. We got to keep a positive attitude and get through this. And I think we might emerge stronger at the end. Time for questions.
I think that's a very good message. Yeah, we really should be able to pull together and come out as a team when we face common challenges. And maybe that's one of the beauties of this COVID, that or potential beauties in it, if we can talk about beauties in the COVID, is that it's a common challenge for all manhood. So we need to think of it as one entity. How are we going to solve this crisis as a global entity?
Yep.
Now let's look into some of the questions. And again, you feel free to write questions in the chat on the topics that we are talking about, or if it's off topic and we might actually find it interesting anyway and talk about it. So yeah, here's a question from Mintu Koivisto. Do you think the International Space Station deserves a Nobel Peace Prize? So here they say it's been nominated for the 4th time.
So I absolutely do, and I was part of the last package when it went to the Nobel Peace Prize, because I was working as the executive director of the ISS National Lab. I think first of all, it's probably one of the great engineering feats of our civilization. And 16 different nations and other nations partnered together. They're not officially partners, but they participated in different subsystems. But we all worked together to build this amazing facility up in low Earth orbit. As I said, politics never made it to the space station, to my knowledge. And we had problems in Crimea. We've had problems all over the world at different points during the last 20 years that we've been occupying the space station. And we just worked together. One of the most professionally satisfying moments I had was when I went up there on my first flight, and a former MiG-29 pilot, a Russian pilot, was up there. And he and I was an F-15 guy in the Air Force, US Air Force. So we trained to shoot each other down. But when we were up there, we were comrades. I took him into the shuttle. He'd never been in a space shuttle before. He told me it was a lot like the Buran. And we laughed and shared and got the job done together. It was really, really satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I have a background in political science and international politics, so this has always been an interest of mine, and I find it fascinating that already back in the 1970s, there was the first common mission of U.S. and USSR astronauts, and that no matter what, during the Cold War, there were missions together, and after the Cold War, with the space nation being built. And no matter what crisis we're on Earth, it seems that the space nation was always off limits. So I think that's something we really can learn from. And of course, we will always have our differences back on Earth. But if we somehow can project that on ourselves, so that we consider some things off limit and find a way to peacefully negotiate things. Other questions. Here is one from Priyanka Das Raikakati.
Okay, I'm not going to say
pronouncing that some way wrong, but that's a question related to my actual research. He says, do you have any thoughts on the importance of cultural activities, art, music, non-mission related interactions during ISS space missions or confined space missions in general?
I think we're finding that some of those art and passions, hobbies that we have, are becoming more and more important the longer we stay in flight. My flights were relatively short, 16 days each, but we've sent people, upwards of a year and more. And we're finding that emotional things like having plants around, having good music, watching the movies of the time and staying up on the news of the time, and other artful endeavors are really important for the human soul. We get intellectually challenged or mentally challenged around the 6-month point is what some research shows. And so maybe we could extend that period, because if we have a mission to Mars, it's going to take several years as opposed to, 6 or 12 months.
Yeah, and you talked about, when we were talking about wheels, that it was solar rays that caused the problem. And I imagine that's one of the biggest challenges of flying to Mars. We pretty much have the technology. I mean, we've been sending robots there, but isn't that the greatest challenge, radiation, because we are outside of the magnetic field of Earth?
Yeah, so I'd say absolutely, radiation is probably the greatest risk that we haven't been able to mitigate yet, but pretty much all the other technologies there. But it's also dealing with, you want efficient, happy crew members. And so, again, it's going to be a challenge to have these super long missions. Now we are simulating long missions on the ground. The biosphere is one example where we put to get people together for years at a time. Actually, you just wrote a paper within the last month or so that included Jane Pointer and her discussions about isolation. But isolation is huge, and it's not something that we should take lightly.
Yeah, and I guess some people are realizing that. I just saw in the news today that the WHO is now warning nations about the psychological effect of the lockdown and the virus, and that people need to put more money into mental health as a response to that. Now, we have more questions here. Here's one from Susindar Marimutu. How are astronauts of today different from the ones, let's say, 20 years ago? What are the new skill sets that are evolving? Now, that's an interesting question.
Well, that is a great question. So when Wheels and I came into the class of 1998, we had really kind of two tracks that you're going down. You were a mission specialist or you were a pilot. Now, a lot of the mission specialists were pilots, but it affected what your crew duties were going to be on the plane now, or the shuttle. And as far as I was a pilot, and the commander was also a pilot on previous shuttle flights. And the two of us were the trained pilots, along with a flight engineer who's a mission specialist. But then the other mission specialists focused on robotics, on experiments, on doing spacewalks and other duties. So really, as the pilot, once I got attached to the space station, I was really the maid, the butler, the plumber, the janitor, and the morale cheerleader for the flight. But the new astronauts, they've brought those kind of two realms together, and I think most of the astronauts are pretty much trained to be, multi-purpose in whatever is required for the mission. More expeditionary kind of training to learn how to work with teams and adapt and be creative and crisis management and those sorts of things. Endurance, resilience. So I think the training is focusing more on the long duration space flights, because as we get outside of low Earth orbit, the missions are going to be longer.
So I imagine that this brings us to the next point, which is both something that's important in crisis and also in isolation. Now, I know from my own backcountry, if I refer to that again, Iceland is very isolated. It's been really hard to survive there for the last 1,000 years. We didn't actually, we were the same number of people from the year 1000 until the year 1850, approximately, because people would just die. So we have this saying, which is "Katarettas," which actually means that things are going to work out in the end. So it's like in this atmosphere or this mindset of optimism, which you need to have faith that there is a solution. Otherwise you just give up and die. So unless you have this faith that you will find the solution, even though you don't see it anywhere. So what can you tell us about that? I mean, I heard the same when recently in an interview with Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes, who were on the Apollo 13, and they spoke about this. There were two things. It was optimism and never giving up. That was crucial to their survival. So what is this role of optimism?
Okay, so you touched on it earlier. It's focus on the things that can be positive, that can solve the problem, and don't focus on the negatives to try to figure out who caused the problem. That doesn't matter when you're under stress. And having a positive attitude can also give you better mental well-being. As Wheels says, not having to take the credit, but being part of the solution together. Another thing is listening. I've worked with some great leaders who know the answer, the right answer, about 95% of the time. But if they don't listen, they'll never get better than 95%. And that other 4 or 5% can be harvested from the team members who are being supportive team members and sharing in the solution to approach 100%. And although reaching 100% is probably impossible, very well-trained and highly functioning teams can approach very interesting solutions that couldn't be contemplated just by 1 or 2 people.
Yeah, and I guess that also brings us to what we were speaking about last time, which is the need to have different skill sets and the need to have conflicts to be more innovative and have a more chance of finding solutions.
And everybody, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, continue.
But everybody has to do their part. That's really the analogies to this global lockdown, is everybody needs to do their part. Everybody has to be part of the team of, we're all globally connected on this spaceship Earth that we live on. And we all need to strive to be, and it's been said by many astronauts in the past, but we do need to strive to be real, positive crewmates and not just be in passengers along for the ride and expecting that what you do isn't going to influence everybody else, because it will.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that's maybe one of the amazing things, because yeah, we're all on the same team now, and we all need to participate and do our share so we don't spread the virus or something like that. That's actually a very good point. Another thing about the optimism and the mental health, so sleep is very important. So we have an interesting question here from someone who is actually depriving himself of sleep to participate, because he's in Australia and the clock is now 4:30 in the morning. So he has a question. And he gets this question a lot from his students. He says, do you need a pillow to sleep in space? And if not, what do you use?
And the answer is,
or would you still like it?
You know, honestly, okay, and again, the people who've been up there 6 months, 12 months at a time can answer better probably. But my 2 16-day bouts, I say pretty much no. I mean, maybe a little bit of padding on the head part of your sleeping bag that you zip yourself into, so that, you know, maybe your head's not knocking against a really hard surface. But you don't need a pillow per se. It certainly needs to be attached to you in some way. Otherwise, it'll just float off. What's more important is that you get yourself in a comfortable location. For me, it was up against the lockers, because I tend to be a little bit warmer than my house occupants or my spaceship crewmates. And so being up against a cold metal surface like the floor or the lockers on the middeck of the shuttle made me more comfortable. I also felt like being up against something and not just suspended in the air in levitation.
Okay, but this doesn't sound very cozy. It sounds like you're sleeping in the locker room, on the floor, or on the bench, or floating in the air. We have a question here from Jenny, which relates to that maybe in a way. So she says, I work in privacy, and I'm interested to know whether you ever get privacy in space.
The answer is you do. On the International Space Station, they do have sleep stations where you can actually get privacy in this little room that's not much bigger than a coffin, but it's really comfortable. You've got a light, you've got a laptop that's tied in with wireless. You can often even talk to your wife or kids on the planet using the KU band signals that we can bounce off of TDRS. So you do have, you can have quiet there. I found quiet on the Russian side, pretty close to where the Soyuz is docked, or was docked on my flight. And I could sit in there for 15, 20 minutes and not see a person. The space station is huge. It's the size of a football field. And so although we can't get outside without a spacesuit, and Wheels could talk to that, I can't. I just helped about 9 other pairs go outdoors. But in the space station, there's lots of places you can go.
Okay, that's very good. That's very good. Here we're going to take another question here from Pravnes. Hello, Greg. What skill sets can we gain while we are in quarantine that can be useful for astronaut training in the future?
Well, one thing is you can attend webinars like this, where you can talk to people that are in your similar situation and share their experiences and their thoughts. I think it's really important, as we are in quarantine all around the world, that we continue to enrich ourselves in areas that maybe you didn't have time to enrich yourself in the busy world that you had before. And so this enrichment, you know, I think our webinars that are coming up are going to be an example of that kind of enrichment that you can experience in your living room all around the world. Yeah.
One final question I'm going to take before we move on. This one is from Susantar Marimutu. A question specific to disaster management and mitigation. What do you do in a situation where your training and instincts point in different directions? This is an interesting question.
Yeah,
the
I think
dilemma
that's interesting.
yeah.
Okay, so training is just that, right? Training is can be very specific, or like we said before, it can be more generalized, and it's more about a process. So if your instinct leads you in a different direction, there should be a red flag that maybe the training that you received for this didn't include some other factors, which is why it's important to gather all the inputs from the team, okay? And don't just say, you know, how can we do this, but how could this fail? I think great leaders around the world ask that question to their subordinates probably more than any other question, is what are we missing? You know, and your instinct will lead you to have that question. And then then you start listening and devise a better plan, perhaps. You know, like I said, in situations where we are challenged, innovation accelerates, and this pandemic is no exception. So I think innovation is going to flourish in this environment. So I'd say that's a time to take pause, you know, inventory your ideas, and maybe rethink a little bit. And maybe you'll go with the training after all, but at least you're cross-examining it with your instincts, which were also created by training.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's probably why you need to repeat the same things in training so often, so it becomes intuitive and it becomes part of your instinct.
Right.
So I guess, yeah, there's a warning flag
Well
when
said,
there is
well
something
said.
that's off. Yeah, yeah. Well, time flies. I'm always surprised how fast time goes.
Oh my
when we're
goodness,
talking
it
about
has.
this. Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our upcoming online course, and that actually relates to the last question, which is the skills that we can train. So we're going to have an online course which consists of 5 different sessions. And in those sessions, we do a combination of input from an expert together with group sessions. So where the participants go out in breakout sessions and they discuss a certain topic. We come back and we do a Q&A and we discuss the results. And finally, you get a home assignment, which you complete before your next session. So in those 5 sessions, we start with the new space age, where we have Stefan Recchi coming to us, which we have mentioned earlier. So he is from Gen Space, and he is also part of Space Nation. And he's an angel investor in space companies. So he's very well versed in everything that's happening in the space industry today on the innovation level, meaning that he is very good at predicting what will happen and what is realistic in the next 10 to 20 years. So what does it really mean that we have the SpaceX and Blue Origin designing reusable space rockets? What are the opportunities that it opens up? What does it mean for us back on Earth, everything that's happening, and why is it important for us? So I think it will be a very educational talk and an interesting one. The second one is also something that I'm very excited about. We will get Dr. Jim Rice, who is an astrogeologist from Arizona State University. Now, he has been working for 15 years on as the head of geology for the Spirit and Opportunity rovers on Mars. So that's probably the closest you can come to living on Mars. So he's been working there for 15 years. So he will know better than anyone what are the challenges and obstacles to our traveling to actually both Moon and the Mars. What do we need to keep in mind when we build our colonies there? And I think that's something that people are quite excited about. You know, how will life be on Mars, and how realistic is it, and is it really going to happen in the 30s? Again, I'm an optimist. I think so. I think we'll see the first human on Mars in the 30s. And I look very forward to it. Yes.
Also, Dr. Jim Rice has a rich history of working with astronauts in geology training here in the States and in Iceland and other places. So
yeah, that's
not only
true,
does he have a
true.
knowledge of the unmanned systems, but also the human missions.
Yes. And he told me about an amazing trip he did. Actually, I think it was one of the last USSR missions to Antarctica, or just after the fall of the USSR. And he's done 10 geology missions to Iceland, and that's also why he will be one of our experts on our own astronaut training expedition in Iceland, where we go in the same regions where the Apollo astronauts train. And he took because you mentioned Dean Armstrong and the Armstrong family earlier. So he took the Armstrong family to the training fields where Neil Armstrong had been training before he went to the moon. So they all went to Iceland. So yes, I also very much look forward to go with him on those expeditions. Now, the third one, that's where you come in again, Greg, and that's adaptability and the value of expeditionary skills. And this is something that we've touched upon in our 2 webinars. And what I see in expeditionary skills is that when we go to the moon, and especially when we go to Mars, this becomes even more important because the delay in communications will be much more than when we're circling Earth, which means that the astronaut will not be able to get constant feedback or information from Earth. He will have to rely on the information he has right in front of him and make his own decisions. So I guess that puts more demand on the astronaut himself and the team he has with him on the ground, whatever ground that is. So that also means that adaptability to extreme environments, team building skills, etc., will be of great importance. Our 4th session, which is called Rediscovering Earth, the Overview Effect and the Astronaut Mindset. And I saw a film recently about the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, where the main message of the film was that we went to the moon and we discovered Earth. And it actually happened on Apollo 8 and not Apollo 11. So that's where we got the moon, the Earth rise, the image of Earth rising from beyond the moon, which is fascinating and maybe plays back into all that space has already given us back to Earth. And I'm not sure people always realize it or appreciate it, but we use space technology every single day. Our weather information is based on satellite data. Our mobile phones are based on satellite data. Our Google Maps is based on satellite data and GPS. Even our smartwatch is based on satellite data. So, I mean, we wouldn't have identified the hole in the ozone layer if it wasn't for space and space technology. And that meant that we were able to react to it and fix that, which is quite amazing. And for me, it gives me a lot of optimism about our future. And everyone is talking about climate change. And when you read articles about climate change, you get depressed. But when you read articles about all the technology and innovations that are being developed, you get inspired and you get optimistic and you see that, wait a minute, we can solve all the challenges that are in front of us. It's just a matter of will and decisions and doing the right thing. So that's really inspiring in many ways. And finally, we will get back to part of what we spoke about today, and that's also you, Greg. You were doing the 3 last sessions, crisis management scenarios and planning for the unknown, which is pretty much what we've spoken about today, but also the role of scenario planning and how we plan for something we know nothing about, whether that is a new situation on the moon, our own world, our job security with AI and the 4th industrialization, or whatever else it is. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Greg.
Well, I would say here, Tor, you did a great review. You know, all these courses were specially selected because they have applicability not only to those of us who are space-minded and or involved in the space industry or the new space, but also they apply to our lives today here on the planet. You know, we're globally connected, and some of the lessons that we learn from, you know, going out into the unknown, pushing the envelope into space, we're just scratching the surface. But many of those skills and mindsets apply to our daily lives here?
Yeah, and I just this is a new course that we're doing, which means that this is a unique opportunity to develop your astronaut skills online. This has not been offered before. We are doing at an amazingly cheap price. You can just compare it to any other course of similar scale. I mean, these are live courses with home assignments and group discussions with top experts in their fields. And we are offering 50% off as an introductory price. We have had fantastic response to our webinar here. We got over 200 registrations in the last 72 hours. We only have 80 seats for the online course, so I really encourage you to sign up fast if you want to secure your seat. So I want to thank you all. We have now finished our time. Maybe if we have any questions about the online courses, we can maybe take a couple of minutes on that. But well, we don't have any questions as it is about the online courses, but we have quite a lot of questions that we didn't manage to answer, and we'll try to look through them and cover them in the content in our online course. But I want to thank you all for very interesting discussions and for the participation in the webinar today. I know we could continue all night to discuss all the topics that are up ahead, but we will hopefully see most of you next week when we will start with the new space age and what's happening in space in the next 10 to 20 years. You can also follow our activities in social media. You can sign up on our newsletter or follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, wherever. Yeah, I hope to see you next week. Greg,
thank you for moderating this. You did a great job.
Thank you, and pleasure as always to talk to you. You have a lot of experience to share.
Thank you, everyone.
So, thank you. Take care and stay safe.